Great. So I'll go ahead and give the introduction or just a quick introduction to our guest, Kelli. I had the opportunity to listen to a webinar that she did for our office at the Small Business Development Center about, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, month ago. I'm not exactly sure. Time kind of flies, but Kelli did a great job in presenting some issues related to the employment environment and the legal landscape of having employees and having an employment workplace. And that's kind of her specialty. So I wanted her to join us. I think tonight, a lot of what we're going to talk about is just kind of, kind of back and forth Q&A. We're hoping everybody else can jump into it. And Kelli's going to give us a little insight into what the world looks like coming out of the pandemic. So Kelli, let me go ahead and let you introduce yourself and your firm. Talk a little bit about your specialty and what exactly it is that you do, and tell us a little bit about what an ideal client looks like for you. Because again, we're all plugged into different businesses and different companies that we work within.
Thank you for having me. My name is Kelli Riley, and my business is Riley Law in Northern Colorado. I started my law practice about 6 years ago, and my practice serves small businesses that are looking to stay out of trouble. And I help small businesses with things like handbooks, non-compete agreements, employment agreements, training, and policies. And I work with employees that are in every stage of a conflict or potential conflict with their employer. From calling me saying, I've been written up and I think I'm going to get fired, to going through trial and appeals. So I primarily work with employees that are having disputes over issues like unpaid wages or commissions, discrimination in the workplace, wrongful termination or retaliation, and things like sexual harassment. When it comes to working with small businesses, the businesses that I work with usually have hearts of gold. They're really looking to take good care of their employees and want to do the right thing, comply with the law. They often feel completely overwhelmed by the legal landscape, and they really just care about running their business. And they don't even know where to start when it comes to making sure they're following the laws when it comes to having employees. And Colorado's laws have changed significantly in the last year. And a lot of them apply even if you only have one employee, and even if that employee only works a few hours a week. My ideal client is a professional. Typically, that professional is a woman, but I work with men, I work with women. And that ideal client is a professional because that tends to be people who are higher wage earners. There's a lot of money in controversy if they haven't been paid their commission or bonus. And it makes sense to bring an attorney in to help them negotiate a resolution to their conflict. So that's my ideal client. I want to give you a quick plug. I'm working on a second business, which is I'm opening a co-working space in Northern Colorado as well. And that is going to be opening in the spring of 2022. So if you have any questions about that or know someone who's looking for office space, don't hesitate to reach out to me about that as well.
Where's it located?
Kelli, where do you see that located? Yeah, thanks, Kelli.
It's going to be at Centera.
At
Centera. Thank you.
Yeah. Great.
So what I wanted to talk to you about today is some of those big changes that came out of the last year, and the overwhelming majority of them were in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And Jeff and I kind of talked about having sort of a Q&A format to address some of your burning questions. I have some of my notes just to make sure I don't miss anything, any of the highlights, but Jeff, I'll kind of turn it over to you to ask some of the questions that you wanted to make sure that we addressed tonight.
Sure. So when we first had Kelli join us and do the presentation for the Small Business Development Center, there was the forum and the chat box that you always have in these types of calls, and starts to fill, as people have questions. When Kelly started to talk about vaccinations and, can an employer do this? Can they not? That's when all of the activity lit up the board. And I think that's very topical. I think our audience at that time was very Eastern Colorado. So, it invoked a certain maybe political pushback to broad brush, but that was the piece that seemed to be of most interest to people. So I was hoping that we could kind of talk through some of that. I think it's actually of value to go back in time a little bit to frame this conversation. There was a Supreme Court case all the way back in 1905. The case is called Jacobson versus the state of Massachusetts. Jacobson was a pastor who did not believe that he should have to be vaccinated. The Supreme Court disagreed, and disagreed strongly with the 7-2 ruling. In fact, the language of it that came out was basically that the ruling gave the authority of the state to enforce compulsory vaccination laws. And in the actual language that came out of the case, and I want to quote it specifically, was individual liberty is not absolute and is subject to the police power of the state. So a pretty draconian ruling that affects all of us, that is over 100 and close to 20 years old now. It's been upheld several times. It's been invoked in a number of other Supreme Court cases. It's never been challenged successfully. So long ago, at least in the eyes of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, we've long settled the idea of, can a state require, the state, capital S, require people to be vaccinated in cases of public health. And there, of course, are limited exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's important because it brings us kind of fast forward to this debate that we're having now. So, Kelly, you want to talk a little bit about what the vaccination, policy can be? Can an employer force you to be vaccinated? Can they fire you if you're not? You want to talk through a little bit of that?
Absolutely. So the EEOC came out with guidance towards the end of last year, when the vaccine became clearly imminent, that it was going to be rolled out very soon, and said that employers can require their employees to be vaccinated and can terminate employees for failing to get vaccination. The guidance is not as clear on how you can require your employees to prove it to you that they got vaccinated. So what I would caution you on, if you are an employer, is to be aware of Colorado's privacy laws. If you are requiring your employees to provide a copy of their vaccination record or a doctor's note saying they've been vaccinated, just be aware that you are required to take security measures to ensure the security of any kind of document like that contains medical information. Any kind of document that shows any kind of medical treatment. So something saying they have been vaccinated or received the vaccine would be a medical record. Something that would not be a medical record would be an email from your employee saying, I've been vaccinated. If you feel really strongly that you need to have rock solid proof, you can ask for a copy of the vaccine record or a doctor's note. If you don't want to go through the procedural hurdle of having to make sure that you have firewalls protecting their medical records, you can go on the honor system. I do a weekly video series called Coffee with Kelly, where I answer frequently asked questions or questions that people call in and ask me about. And I answered a question someone asked me recently, which was, if I don't get vaccinated and my employer says I have to wear a mask if I decide not to get vaccinated, first, is that okay that they can make me continue wearing a mask when everyone else doesn't have to wear one anymore because they got vaccinated? That's totally fine. You can definitely have that policy in place. The next question was, The policy went on to say, if I get COVID-19 because I didn't wear a mask, but I said I was vaccinated, can they fire me? And I said, they can't fire you for getting COVID-19. So Colorado law says that you can't retaliate against an employee for getting COVID-19, but you can fire an employee for lying. So that's something that I think may give employers some comfort if they're relying on that honor system about whether or not their employee got vaccinated. You can, in theory, get COVID-19 even if you got vaccinated. But at that point, then you could press them a little more and say, I want that doctor's note saying you were vaccinated and you still got COVID-19. But if you decide to go with the honor system, you can then know in the back of your mind, if they get COVID-19 and present a risk to our office, I can terminate them because they lied to me about it.
So
Yeah.
Kelly, I wanted to ask you, it doesn't appear that the vaccine card is a legal document. It looks like it could be very easily faked. And so what's the status of that as far as being actual proof of vaccination?
I think that really is up to your discretion whether or not you would accept that as proof of vaccination. I think the same could be said for a doctor's note. And that's the other reason I would really encourage you to make a judgment call about whether or not you want to handle those medical records for all your employees, or whether you want to take your employees' word for it that they did in fact get vaccinated.
Kelly, yeah, I think
Go ahead,
that,
Jeff.
I think that dovetails into kind of the next piece of what I was kind of hoping you could provide a little light on. You already have started going down that path, but this concept of disclosure. So they recently in the news, Goldman Sachs basically sent out an email to all of their employees that said, you have 24 hours to respond back to us. Did you get vaccinated? Yes or no? Respond back. No questions, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Respond back. And that disclosure, are they doing that to limit their own liability? Are they doing it because they want to have this record? I mean, not having, insider knowledge as to why they're doing it. Can you hypothesize a little bit about that? And then at the same time, talk a little bit about liability for employers. So if you're providing an environment in which you're hoping your people are vaccinated, or you've asked them if they're vaccinated, but somebody lies and half of your staff gets COVID and deaths and whatever else may occur out of that. Can you speak just a little bit and kind of put those pieces together for us?
So those measures are targeted at trying to mitigate risks and reduce liability. Colorado's workers' compensation laws are pretty robust and make it difficult to pursue an employer for any kind of liability. However, I think it would be extremely difficult to bring a claim against your employer saying, I got COVID-19 at work, because it is so contagious, and we are in a pandemic. If you knew the reason you got it was because of contact with someone at work, I think that's definitely a possibility. So that's something to keep in mind. But I have yet to see that particular fact pattern come up, which I think is telling given the fact that we've been in this pandemic for about 15 months. The other risk that I think employers are looking to mitigate is providing appropriate accommodations for those high risk employees, making sure that they have a workplace that is accommodating to all employees, including those that are not able to be vaccinated. And for the majority of those employers, that accommodation has been pretty simple. They let those higher risk employees continue to work remotely. But for employers for whom that is not possible to allow those employees to work remotely, they need to know they can bring them into the workplace and assure those employees that are high risk that it is not an unsafe place for them to come to work.
Kelly, is that something that you would, in the work that you do, is that something that you would provide consultancy around, or is that really more of like a risk mitigation role that, an attorney, a legal office like yourself would not be involved in, advising on that kind of safe workplace best practices?
It's a little bit of a foot in two territories. So, if the reason you're looking to mitigate risk is only to reduce your insurance costs, that's a little out of my wheelhouse. But you are telling me that Helen, who works in payroll, won't come back to work until you tell her everyone is vaccinated. That's definitely a conversation I can have with you to make sure we're taking steps so that Helen feels safe to come back to work. And that's really the conversation that a lot of employers are having, is how do we get everyone back to work that needs to be physically in the workplace again, and make that transition smooth and make sure everyone feels safe at work again.
The other question that was kind of invoked when you were talking, even just about COVID, and did I catch COVID at my place of employment? Is there precedent cases that came before connected to other, diseases, the flu, for example, we have that every year, the something else. I mean, is it that in Colorado we're quite protective of our employers, and therefore it's difficult to bring any sort of case, or is it just kind of specific to this disease because it's ubiquitous in society? It's very difficult to figure out where it came from. Is there any precedent around that?
There is precedent. I used to practice some workers' compensation, and I had a client that contracted tuberculosis at work. She was a nurse, and she was exposed to a tuberculosis patient. And she brought a workers' compensation claim because it was clear that that was where she had contracted it. I think it is different in this case, where it is ubiquitous, and it would be very difficult to say you only had exposure to it at work. But I don't think it's impossible for an employee to make a claim like that. And it could be at minimum a headache, and at most a potential exposure and risk and a payout.
Sure. The kind of the last thought that I had, and then, I think everybody should be able to, kind of jump in, but just to kind of go across the whole spectrum of the thoughts that I had with this conversation was that, in the beginning of the pandemic, you had a lot of pushback of this concept of government overreach. I mean, none of us liked having our favorite restaurant shut down, and none of us liked, the restrictions and all of these kinds of things. And it became, again, political theater of, well, can a state, or state with capital S, force us to shut down? And the answer seemed in a lot of cases to be yes. And now we're seeing on the back end of this, where we're also getting, in the concept there in the beginning of this was, no, government shouldn't be involved in business. Business should have autonomy to operate and do things the way that they want to do. Now we're seeing on the back end of this where certain companies are trying to mitigate risk and prevent themselves from being subjugated to liability. And now we have the same group, in fact, pushing back on that concept, saying, well, no, you can't actually do this. And I'm specifically thinking about what's happening down in, we've got legislation sitting on the books in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas. DeSantis in Florida just signed a bill in which, that bill essentially prohibits companies from asking their customers if they've been vaccinated. So it's not allowing businesses to operate autonomously. In fact, it's forcing them under, again, the same heavy-handedness of the government. Specifically, that puts him at odds with the cruise industry that's down there, that feels as though they're going to mitigate some of their liability by asking customers. those things are going to be challenged inevitably. I mean, the governor signs the law, and that's far from the end of it. In a crystal ball, where do you see that type of debate playing out? And I don't mean to put you on the spot like that, but we did talk earlier this afternoon. So
Yes.
I am asking you to look into a crystal ball for us.
So I dusted off my crystal ball. And I will speak to what I think will play out in Colorado, because
Great.
it's the scope I'm most familiar with, but I think it applies to a lot of Western states. When I was in law school, a lot of people would say, oh, Colorado's a liberal state. And I would tell them, Colorado's not a liberal state. Colorado is a libertarian state. It politically tends to, politically and legislatively tends to lean toward doing the least amount of intervention to prevent chaos. And it's kind of the Wild West. We've seen an erosion of that, leaning more in the direction of becoming a little more liberal on the, social spectrum over the last couple years. We're seeing some more progressive legislation coming into effect, but it is still hard fought getting that stuff passed. It's not as if every single thing that is employee friendly comes onto the books, or every single thing that hurts businesses gets signed into law. So looking into my crystal ball, I don't think we would see similar legislation telling businesses what to do get signed into law in Colorado. What I would say is Colorado has this history with the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision. So Masterpiece Cake Shop was a case where a gay couple asked a business to make them a wedding cake, and the business owner refused to do it for First Amendment reasons. And it has gone up to the Supreme Court. It's been sent back. Other people have gone to Masterpiece Cake Shop, trying to get Masterpiece Cake Shop to make transsexual conversion cakes. And they just keep appealing it over and over again. So what I would caution you as a business owner is don't tempt fate. It's probably not best practice to ask your customers for vaccination records. It's probably not even best practice to ask them if they've been vaccinated. What I am seeing at a lot of restaurants and stores is a sign that says, if you've been vaccinated, we no longer require you to wear a mask. That's probably as far as I would go. Asking questions beyond that could start to get into territory where you might be potentially raising hackles for people that you might be doing disability discrimination, asking people about their medical conditions, treating people differently because they have medical conditions where they can't get vaccinated. If someone says, no, I haven't been vaccinated and they're not wearing a mask, are you going to ask them to leave the store? You don't want a Masterpiece Cake Shop situation in an area where people are already really sensitive. That's what I would recommend. That's what I see in my crystal ball, but also what I think is best practice.
I think that just as a follow-up comment to that, I think one of the tragedies of what's happened with the pandemic, and again, this is me editorializing, so it's not a question or necessarily a comment, but has been the fact that we've required people to encounter uncomfortable conversations that they had no intention of ever having signed up for. So for example, I think a lot of service workers inside restaurants that are again, front line or front of house in which they're dealing with customers, and then they have to go have these awkward conversations with patrons about, we need you to wear a mask, or we need you to spread out, or we can't have more than, X number of you at one table. That is not what they signed up for. And it's also not comfortable for them. They've not been trained in how to do that. And were we asking people to enforce things that they didn't really have the skill set to enforce? And I think that's created a lot of awkwardness. In the most extreme cases, you see that on, the airlines where people are, getting in fisticuffs with flight attendants. I mean, a flight attendant certainly didn't sign up for that as part of the job description. So anyway, yeah, there's my editorial comment. Before we kind of just open it up to questions, and I don't want to get into a series of hypotheticals because I know that could go into an absolute rabbit hole. But let's say somebody walks into a bar, and the bartender asks, well, you don't look that good. Do you have any sort of issues with your liver? Is that is that out of bounds? That seems in a little bit of parallel to asking somebody if they've been vaccinated, or if they've been, at what point are you into medical?
I see Kelly cringing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm clutching my pearls, in addition to just being really rude.
That's true.
So
I guess let me rephrase that question. What is different about asking somebody about vaccination and or like their COVID exposure that would be different than asking about any sort of other medical situation that may endanger either that person themselves or someone else that's near them?
It's a public health emergency, so it's just got different rules.
Yep. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, should we open things to kind of some questions?
Absolutely.
Kind of where everybody else sits and thoughts.
Well, I do have a question. I am curious. I know that some universities are requiring students to be vaccinated in order to return to in-person class. And my wee sister went to the University of San Diego. Now she just graduated. However, the university sent out an email for returning students that said, you have to be vaccinated if you want to attend the in-person class. And they're not giving an option, if you're not vaccinated, you can, but you have to wear a mask. They're not giving that option. They're just doing, if you aren't vaccinated, you have to do online. Where does that fit in? Shouldn't they be able to attend class and wear a mask if they're not vaccinated? Or is that within the university's bounds to decide that?
So, I do think that would comply with the requirements of both Title VII and Title IX, because they're providing a reasonable accommodation for people who are electing not to get the vaccination or who cannot get the vaccination.
Okay, so even though I guess legally, okay. And then now is that because it's in California, it's a California university, or would that be just nationwide?
That would be at any school. So those are both federal laws. So the law requires that you provide a reasonable accommodation. It doesn't have to be the best accommodation. It doesn't have to be the accommodation you would want. You would probably prefer to attend in person and just wear a mask if you don't want to get the vaccine.
Right.
But it just has to be a reasonable accommodation that enables you to have access to the same things.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think we've uncovered a similar kind of thing with handicapped accessibility. That, as long as there is a path to get a wheelchair in a building, the fact that you have to go 100 feet out of your way is not optimum by any means, but is reasonable, and so I would say that's probably a similar logic.
Kelly, this is really interesting, and I'm curious to know, and you sort of already made note of it or mentioned it just previously with Lauren's question, but what is the overlap between the states? Because I understand that you're speaking mostly towards Colorado law, but you also were able to answer a question about California law. So how much of what you're talking about is actually national versus state? What's the difference between the states? Is it really that big?
So I will give the classic lawyer answer.
Can't be.
So Colorado law is, in many respects, much more progressive than our contiguous neighbors, such as Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas. I will probably throw Utah in there, but I can't say for certain. In the sense that it provides more rights to employees, but not in every respect. And that has been a change that I have seen over the last 2 years or so, really start to shift in that direction. But there are laws like Title VII, which prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, age, gender, national origin, religion, as well as some other categories. That applies nationwide. And as long as you have a certain number of employees, you are covered by that law. The same thing for the Americans with Disabilities Act. That applies to every employer. Even though Colorado has a companion law that goes with that, the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. There are also some other laws. So I mentioned the guidance from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So that guidance, in theory, would only apply to employers with at least 15 employees. But a Colorado court would probably look at that guidance and use it as a guidepost and say, even though we don't have a Colorado agency saying that it's okay to require vaccinations, the EEOC is a preeminent source where we look to as experts on employment law.
So you're talking about a case where it's not like violating an actual law, but looking at best practices, if you will, to say that, well, across the country, this tends to be what people do. And at the national level, they have a ruling, although it's not law, that says this. And so that actually matters in when an employee has a beef with something that they might get a judgment in their favor because of that.
Exactly.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Kelly, in kind of the early days, and maybe even now, as we're kind of, hopefully, fingers crossed, exiting some of this, what were clients coming to you, asking? What was the anxieties? What were their, kind of what were some of the things that they were thinking through? Because I do think we opened up an entire conversation that maybe we haven't had in, well, certainly in any of our lifetimes, but 100 years ago, maybe they had the same conversation. What were people coming to you with?
At the very beginning, I was getting contacted by a lot of people who wanted to start working remotely, who did not feel safe continuing to go to work, and their workplace had not yet shut down, or their workplace had shut down and basically just laid them off. And they were calling me saying, I could do my work anywhere. Why won't they let me keep working? Now that we are going on the downhill side, I'm hearing from employees on a similar vein. They're making me come back to work and I feel safe, or I could do my job from anywhere. Why are they making me come back to the office? And now that we have 15 months of people working remotely and having success with that, what I think is going to be a real challenge is for employers to make a good case that the employee has to come back. I think if you are in this situation, schedule a call with me. Let's walk through it and tell me why it absolutely is imperative that that employee come back to work if your employee is really resisting it. What I'm seeing is that employees want to come back like a couple days a week, but employees are freaking out if they have to come back 5 days a week in the office. Because their childcare situation has changed.
Yeah, you have designed your life
Yeah,
around it.
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. And that obviously then it creates another expense that they've been able to
Avoid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's
Yes.
very hard getting childcare now.
Yes. Yes.
So in a similar vein, Kelly, I wanted to ask you, because I've written a few articles about this recently, the dynamic that we will have more and more hybrid office situations with some people working out of the office and some people not. And the side effect of doing that is that the remote people can end up at a disadvantage on many dimensions for, for pay raises, for promotions, for job opportunities, whatever. Is that something that you tend to get into? And do you see a trend happening yet on that?
I think it's too soon for me to be seeing that issue coming up.
Okay.
And I can just say anecdotally, I have not seen that happening yet. And it's actually a little surprising because there are so many people, even before the pandemic, that worked remotely in Colorado, that I had not seen that issue. But yes, I can just say I have not seen that issue come up yet, where people who are working remotely feel like they're basically left behind or left out. From an employer's perspective, what I would encourage you to do when you are evaluating pay increases, promotional opportunities, anything along those lines, Colorado has a new law that went into effect this year called the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, that says that if you are offering promotional opportunities or paying employees who are similarly situated doing substantially equal work, you need to be able to justify differences in their pay for very specific reasons. So it needs to be seniority, production, education that is specifically tied to the job. So someone has a master's degree and you actually need that master's degree to do more advanced work in that job. And there are some other criteria that I could go over with you if you were in a position where you were looking at that. So if you are making those decisions and you have two employees, one who's in the office, one who's working remotely, I would caution you to be very careful about not making that decision based on whether or not one of them is in person, because that could potentially violate the Equal Pay Act.
Yeah, well, the problem is you don't do it consciously. And that, yeah. I guess the reason why I'm closer to this particular one is that it happened to me personally about 15 years ago, but I never thought to like bring it into the legal space or anything like that. It just forced me to change jobs earlier than I had thought. And then my boss ended up losing her job 2 months later. So it was a much larger thing going on there. But, that is an interesting dynamic because I can see some hints that that's starting to happen, or, at least, in the next 6 months or a year, that's going to be more of a concern, especially as we're struggling to find good employees.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely a realistic concern to be aware of.
Yeah.
Kelly, thinking, giving you just kind of the forum to talk about anything you want, thinking, we've talked a lot about COVID and the impacts of that and the pandemic and everything else, but, just in a general sense, what else are you seeing in the world of employment law that employees and companies should be aware of, things that you see that are happening, trends, maybe completely unrelated to the majority of the topic we've talked about tonight, but what's out there that people should be aware of that we should be thinking
Having to
about.
publish salary ranges.
Having to publish salary ranges. So that is another component of the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act, is that when you post a job opening or a promotional opportunity, first of all, you have to post it to your existing employees. And in that job posting, you do have to list the salary range or the wage that job will contain. And so that's one thing, and that applies to every employer. The other thing that I mentioned in the presentation I did that Jeff attended is the Colorado Secure Savings Act went into effect this year. This is a requirement that employers with at least 5 employees offer a retirement savings plan to their employees, and they can either offer a tax deferred plan or they can opt into a sponsored plan. And that is still in the works. They're finalizing the details of that plan, but it is supposed to be finalized at the end of this year and be phased in at that point. So if you are I would say a small to medium employer, just be on the lookout for that and be aware of that requirement. The final thing I would mention is I am seeing, I don't know if it's a Northern Colorado thing, but I am seeing a ton of non-compete agreements come across my desk. I don't know if they have just risen in popularity among small businesses in this area or among startups, or if there's some like small business lawyer out there saying, have all your client or all your employees sign non-compete agreements. But I've just seen a huge swing in the other direction of lots of employees bringing them to me and saying, is it enforceable? I've heard this myth that they're not enforceable. And I'll just debunk the myth. They are enforceable. They just need to be reasonable. And that's a fact-specific determination. But there are some rules. They need to be reasonable geographically. So if you're in Northern Colorado, probably something that's, includes the 3 major cities in Northern Colorado would be reasonable. If it includes all of Colorado, that might not be reasonable. If it includes every state in the country, that's probably also not reasonable unless you do something extremely, highly technical or very, very specific. The reason I wanted to mention it is that if you have key employees, especially key employees that have access to your client list, very key clients that are valuable to your business, and you don't have these agreements in place, you can't just be like, Kelly told me about non-competes. I'm going to call my business lawyer. He's going to draft it up and I'm going to have all my employees sign it and we'll be good to go. I won't have to worry about my employee leaving and stealing all our clients. You have to pay them something in exchange for signing the non-compete. So you want to make sure you check all the boxes, that the agreement is reasonable, that you pay them something in exchange for signing the non-compete. But most importantly, what you want to get out of all of this, of having this agreement with your employee, is that your business is protected. So that is a service I offer, is drafting those agreements, talking with you about your goals, making sure your business is protected from a key employee leaving and stealing all your clients and taking them to a competitor. I recently negotiated a resolution for a client who had been with a company for 14 years. He had millions of dollars of key clients that he could have taken to a competitor because he did not have a non-compete agreement.
Wow.
They offered him $10,000 in severance. And I laughed when he brought it to me, and he was so scared that they wouldn't offer him anything else. But that is not a good offer when you have a key employee leaving who has access to millions of dollars of contracts. So that's just the last piece I would throw in. I'm seeing more of them, but they're not usually done well. And if you are wanting to protect your business, this is not something that I would advise doing from LegalZoom. Spend a little money getting it done right so that you can actually protect your business.
I think that's a good closing thought. Do not always rely on legal Zoom. Sometimes you gotta
Yes.
pick up the phone and call Kelly. I think that's a good idea. Todd, you wanna kind of close this out? I don't know if we want to do just some quick introductions. Kelly and I, we know each other. Glad to sit out of that, but I don't know if you want to just give a quick 10 seconds from everybody.
Sure, if everybody wants to, I mean, I think we all know each other, so if you have
Kelly
some,
doesn't know us.
Yes, I don't know you.
that's true. Yeah, okay, just
We're the trouble causers.
10 seconds. So
Todd, do you want the recording on for that, or should we pop that off and then?
let's go ahead and turn that off.
Good call, Lauren.